525 years before the Common Era, Cambyses the Persian stood at the gates of the Nile Delta and stared at an army he could not beat on paper. Egypt was the ancient world's fortress, ancient beyond reckoning, wealthy beyond greed, and defended by a professional force that had not seen its walls breached in living memory. So the king of Persia did what no sane commander would ever do. He sent his supply officers to gather up every stray cat they could find. Here's the insane part. He didn't order siege towers built. He didn't sharpen another arrow. He ordered his front line to pick up the animals, hold them high, and walk forward into the teeth of the Egyptian bowmen, the same bowmen who could pin a man's shadow to the sand. The threat was overwhelming, and the counter-strategy was a creature small enough to cradle in one hand. According to the later Greek military writer Polyanius, the Persian front ranks carried dogs, sheep, cats, ibises, and whatever else the Egyptians held sacred, and they painted the goddess Bastet on their shields. The plan sounds like the punchline to a bad joke. But when you understand what a cat meant to a soldier of the Nile, you realize this wasn't madness. It was the most ruthless psychological weapon the ancient world ever deployed. Look at what the Persians were betting on. Egypt wasn't just powerful, it was untouchable by reputation, protected by the desert, the delta's canals, and a military machine that had crushed invaders for centuries. The frontier fortress at Pelusium guarded the only practical invasion route, and its garrison was feared across the region. On paper, a frontal assault was total suicide. The Persian army had marched through brutal terrain to get there, exhausted supply lines stretched thin, and the heat pressing down like a hand on the back of the neck. Every conventional approach was a dead end. Siege engines would be burned. Assault columns would be gutted by arrow fire. The dust on the horizon promised nothing but a massacre. But here's what the Persian scouts and spies had learned. In Egypt, a cat wasn't just a pet. It was a vessel of the divine, tied directly to the goddess Bastet, protector of the home, fertility, and warfare's softer side. Killing one, even by accident, was a crime punishable by death. This wasn't a superstition held by the peasant class. It was the law of the land, enforced across every level of society, and foreigners inside Egypt were bound by it just as tightly. Imagine being in those ranks. You're an Egyptian archer, raised on the stories of your gods, and your temple walls lined with the images of Bastet. You've spent your life believing that harming this animal damns your soul. And now, across the field, the enemy isn't charging with spears. They're walking toward you, holding your god out in front of them like a shield. The commander didn't panic, he got creative. He realized the Egyptians' greatest cultural strength was also their greatest tactical weakness. Their reverence was absolute, and absolute reverence creates an absolute blind spot. If you've ever tried to get a cat to do what you want, you understand the sheer madness of betting an invasion on one. They don't obey, they don't cooperate, they don't care about your war. And that was exactly the point. The Persians didn't need the cats to fight. They needed the Egyptians to refuse to hurt them. It was a perfect trap built from the one material the Egyptians could never bring themselves to break. So the plan went into motion. The word spread through the Persian camp, and the soldiers, hardened veterans of a dozen campaigns, must have thought their king had lost his mind. But orders were orders. They gathered the animals, tied them up, and placed them in the front ranks. Then the order came to advance. What happened next was pure chaos. The Persian line stepped forward, and the cats, understandably furious about being conscripted into an army, began to squirm. They yowled, they hissed, they clawed at the hands holding them. The soldiers flinched, their discipline cracking as they tried to keep a grip on creatures that had never once in their lives obeyed a single command. It gets worse. The animals weren't the only thing on the Persian shields. Painted across the bronze was the face of Bastet herself, the goddess the Egyptians believed they were fighting to protect. The message was brutal and unmistakable. If you shoot us, you shoot her. If you strike us, you strike your own soul. The Persians didn't just bring cats to a siege, they brought the Egyptian goddess into their front line and dared the archers to shoot through their own faith. If that is the kind of tactical insanity you want broken down with sources and strategy, subscribe and keep walking into these ancient traps with me, because the next part of this is going to make the plan sound almost plausible. Tell me in the comments, if you were on that wall with Bastet staring back at you from a Persian shield, would you have let the arrow fly? Then came the moment that broke military doctrine forever. The Egyptian archers on the wall raised their bows. Arrows were nocked, strings pulled taut. The Persian line kept advancing, cats held high, the yowling growing louder with every step, and the Egyptians refused to shoot. One archer lowered his bow, then another, then dozens. The front rank of the Persian army, the most vulnerable position in any assault, walked straight into the killing zone of the ancient world's finest bowmen, and not a single arrow was loosed. The trap had snapped shut. Here's the part that breaks your understanding of how battles work. The Persians didn't win this engagement with steel. They won it before a single blade was drawn. The Egyptian ranks began to shake, not from fear of the enemy, but from fear of their own gods. The commanders screamed orders to fire, but the soldiers couldn't bring themselves to obey. Their hands trembled. Their bows pointed at the sky. The plan worked a little too well. Panic spread through the Egyptian line like fire through dry reeds. The soldiers on the wall didn't see an invading army. They saw a wave of sacred animals in the faces of their goddess coming straight at them, and their nerve simply collapsed. Some dropped their weapons. Others turned and ran. The front line broke, and through that breach the Persians poured. Now imagine being in that chaos. The dust, the screaming, the desperate shouts of Egyptian officers trying to hold a line that was already gone. And in the middle of it all, the ceaseless, furious yowling of animals that had no idea they were winning a war. The rout was total. Pelusium fell. The gateway to Egypt was thrown open, and the Persian army rolled toward the heart of the Nile. The brutal aftermath came fast. The capital city fell, the last pharaoh was captured, and the ancient dynasty that had ruled for centuries came to a crashing end. Egypt, the superpower that had seemed untouchable for so long, was annexed to the Persian Empire. The conquest itself is documented history. The cat shield stratagem is the tradition that explains how a single battle could collapse so completely, and that's the part worth sitting with. An empire that worshipped a small animal was conquered by an army carrying that animal into battle. The Egyptians' greatest devotion became their greatest vulnerability. The strongest fortress in the ancient world was breached not by siege engines, but by reverence. If you've ever watched a plan collapse at the final deadline, you know the cold sweat of those Egyptian commanders. They had the weapons, they had the walls, they had every advantage a general could ask for. And none of it mattered, because the thing they were forbidden to touch was walking straight at them. The strategy was so absurd, it circled back around to genius. And that's what I mean. The thing they were forbidden to touch walked straight at them, and the most absurd part is that it worked. Subscribe and I'll keep pulling the next impossible plan out of the history books before your friends spoil it. Tell me in the comments what you'd have done standing in that Egyptian line. Drop your spear or swing at the one creature your gods told you to protect. If you saw the cat gambit coming, drop one word. Bastet. The Persians didn't defeat Egypt with superior numbers or better steel. They defeated it with a cultural landmine, a psychological weapon that turned the enemy's own beliefs into the breach in their walls. And the ancient world took notice. If a few cats could topple the mightiest kingdom on earth, what else could a desperate commander dream up? That question haunts the history books. Because later in another war, another commander faced an even more terrifying weapon on the battlefield, a war elephant charging with nothing but muscle and fury between his lines and annihilation. And the strangest accounts claim the countermeasure he chose was even darker, even more bizarre than a basket of cats. Flaming pigs driven straight into the elephants. Now that is a story worth hearing. Bronze clattered against bronze as the Persian ranks found their rhythm, and somewhere in that terrible harmony, the truth of the whole campaign revealed itself. The Egyptians had built their empire on certainty, on the unshakable belief that their gods would protect them. But certainty has a shadow, and that shadow is the moment belief becomes a cage. The walls of Pelusium didn't crumble. The gates didn't shatter. What fell was something far more fragile, the conviction that had held an entire civilization together. When a soldier can no longer trust his own hands to hold a bow, the fortress he guards is already lost. Egypt didn't lose a battle that day. It lost the story it told itself about being invincible. And that is the deepest irony of the whole affair. The cats were never the weapon. The weapon was the faith that made a grown warrior drop his spear rather than harm a creature he believed carried the divine. In the end, the Persians didn't conquer Egypt with claws or cunning. They conquered it with an idea, the simple, devastating notion that the one thing you revere most can also be the thing that destroys you.